in the darkest corners of military operations, where death whispers closer than your own heartbeat, legends are born not from victories, but from the impossible moments when hope dies and then mysteriously resurrects itself. This is the story of Commander Sarah "Ghost" Martinez, a woman who defied every odd, shattered every barrier, and proved that sometimes the greatest warriors are forged not in training camps, but in the crucible of betrayal, survival, and the burning desire to protect those who can no longer protect themselves. When her own team declared her dead and the military wrote her off as another casualty of war, Sarah Martinez was actually beginning the most dangerous mission of her life. What happened in those 18 months when the world believed she was gone would challenge everything we think we know about loyalty, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve your country. This is not just a story about a female Navy SEAL. This is the story of a ghost who came back to haunt those who tried to bury her alive. The helicopter blades cut through the Afghan night like whispers of death, carrying 8 Navy SEALs toward what intelligence had promised would be a routine extraction mission. Commander Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold metal of the aircraft, watching the jagged mountains below disappear into darkness. At 28, she had already earned more respect from her male counterparts than most soldiers see in a lifetime, but tonight something felt different. The weight in her chest wasn't the familiar pre-mission tension she had grown accustomed to over her 6 years as a SEAL. Sarah had clawed her way through every barrier the military had thrown at her. Born in East Los Angeles to a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night, she had learned early that survival meant being tougher, smarter, and more determined than everyone around her. When she announced her intention to join the Navy at 17, her high school guidance counselor had laughed. When she declared her goal to become a SEAL, her own recruiter had suggested she consider a more suitable career path. But Sarah Martinez had never been interested in suitable. The SEAL training had nearly broken her, just as it was designed to break everyone who wasn't absolutely committed to pushing beyond human limitations. While her male classmates struggled with the physical demands, Sarah faced an additional challenge that no training manual could prepare her for. She had to prove herself not just as a warrior, but as a woman worthy of standing alongside America's most elite fighting force. Every push-up was scrutinized, every tactical decision questioned, every moment of weakness magnified under the microscope of doubt that followed her everywhere. But Sarah had persevered, earning her trident and the grudging respect of her teammates. She had deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan 3 times, leading missions that saved countless lives and eliminated high-value targets that threatened American security. Her call sign, Ghost, had been earned during a particularly harrowing operation in Fallujah, where she had moved through enemy territory for 6 hours without being detected, gathering intelligence that prevented a massive attack on a civilian hospital. Now, as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Sarah found herself commanding a team that included some of the military's most seasoned operators. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, her second-in-command, had been her closest friend since their days in basic underwater demolition training. His loyalty to Sarah had never wavered, even when other team members questioned whether a woman could handle the psychological pressures of leading men into combat. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Tank Rodriguez had initially been one of Sarah's harshest critics, but after she saved his life during an ambush in Kandahar, he had become her most vocal supporter. His massive frame and intimidating presence made him perfect for breaching operations. But Sarah had discovered that beneath his tough exterior was a man who carried photos of his 3 daughters everywhere he went. The rest of the team consisted of specialists whose skills complemented each other perfectly. Petty Officer Second Class David Wire Chen handled all electronic warfare and communications, his slight build hiding a genius-level intellect that could hack into virtually any system. Petty Officer First Class Anthony Preacher Washington served as their medic and sniper, his steady hands equally capable of saving a life or taking one from 800 meters away. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Bulldog O'Connor was their explosives expert, a man whose Irish temper was matched only by his precision with demolitions. Finally, there was Petty Officer Third Class Tommy Kid Stevens, the youngest member of their team at just 22, whose enthusiasm for combat sometimes worried Sarah more than enemy fire. The mission briefing had been straightforward. A CIA operative named David Reeves had been captured by Taliban forces while conducting surveillance on a high-value target in the Kunar province. Intelligence suggested he was being held in a compound approximately 12 kilometers from the Pakistani border, a location that offered the enemy multiple escape routes if they detected an approaching rescue force. The team would insert via helicopter, approach the compound on foot, eliminate or neutralize the guards, extract Reeves, and return to the landing zone within 4 hours. What the briefing hadn't mentioned, and what Sarah wouldn't discover until it was too late, was that David Reeves had been turned by his captors weeks earlier. The CIA had suspected his loyalty might be compromised, but rather than abort the mission, They had decided to use the rescue operation as a way to feed false information to the Taliban through Reeves. The 8 Navy SEALs approaching the compound were not just rescuing a captured agent, they were unknowingly walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. As the helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, Sarah felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every mission. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and those instincts had kept her alive through dozens of operations. But as she led her team off the aircraft and into the hostile territory, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this mission was fundamentally wrong. The landscape around them was typical of the Afghan countryside: rocky, unforgiving terrain that offered little cover and countless hiding spots for enemy forces. The team moved in perfect formation, their night vision goggles turning the darkness into an alien green world where every shadow could hide death. Sarah took point, using hand signals to communicate with her team as they navigated through the treacherous terrain. 3 hours into their approach, they reached a ridgeline that overlooked the target compound. Sarah raised her binoculars and studied the building below. It was larger than the intelligence reports had indicated, with several outbuildings and what appeared to be a significant number of guards patrolling the perimeter. More troubling was the fact that the guards seemed alert and organized, not the relaxed posture typical of forces who believed they were safe from attack. Jake Morrison crawled up beside her and whispered, "Something's not right, Ghost. Those guards are expecting us." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through the possible explanations. Either their intelligence was completely wrong, or someone had leaked information about their mission. Neither possibility was good, but they had come too far to abort without attempting the rescue. David Reeves was counting on them, and no SEAL had ever been left behind on Sarah's watch. She signaled for the team to adjust their approach, taking a route that would bring them to the compound from the north rather than the south as originally planned. The change added 30 minutes to their timeline, but it also reduced their chances of walking into an ambush. As they moved through the darkness, Sarah couldn't help but think about the conversation she had had with Jake before the mission. He had mentioned receiving a phone call from his wife that morning, something about unusual activity around their home in Virginia Beach. Jake's wife Maria was a nurse at the local hospital and not prone to paranoia, but she had noticed the same dark sedan parked across from their house for 3 consecutive days. When she had tried to get a closer look, the car had driven away, only to return a few hours later. At the time, Sarah had dismissed Jake's concerns as pre-mission jitters. Military families often felt anxious when their loved ones deployed, and it wasn't uncommon for that anxiety to manifest in perceived threats that didn't actually exist. But now, as they approached what was obviously a prepared enemy position, Sarah wondered if Maria Morrison's instincts had been more accurate than anyone had realized. The compound was surrounded by a 6-foot concrete wall topped with razor wire, with a single gate on the eastern side that was heavily guarded. Sarah counted at least 12 Taliban fighters visible from their position, all carrying AK-47s and moving with the discipline of experienced soldiers rather than the casual militia fighters they usually encountered in this region. Through her night vision scope, she could see that several of the fighters wore tactical gear that was far too sophisticated for typical Taliban forces. Tank Rodriguez joined them on the ridgeline, his massive bulk somehow managing to move silently through the rocky terrain. He studied the compound through his own binoculars before turning to Sarah with a grim expression. "Boss, this looks like a professional operation. Those aren't village idiots with old Soviet weapons. Someone's been training these guys." Sarah knew Tank was right, that they had come too far to turn back now. David Reeves was somewhere in that compound, probably being tortured for information that could compromise other American operations. Every minute they delayed increased the chances that valuable intelligence would be extracted from him, putting more American lives at risk. She gathered her team around her and outlined the modified plan. They would breach the compound simultaneously from 2 directions, with Tank and Bulldog creating a distraction at the main gate, while Sarah led Jake, Wire, Preacher, and Kid through a weak point in the northern wall. Once inside, they would neutralize the guards, locate Reeves, and extract him through the northern breach point. The plan was solid, based on years of experience and countless similar operations. What Sarah couldn't have known was that David Reeves had provided his captors with detailed information about standard SEAL tactics and procedures. The Taliban forces in the compound weren't just waiting for an attack, they were specifically prepared for the exact type of assault that Sarah's team was about to execute. As the team moved into position, Sarah felt a moment of doubt that she quickly pushed aside. Self-doubt was a luxury that could get her entire team killed, and she had learned long ago to trust her training and the abilities of the men who followed her into battle. Jake Morrison had never let her down, and Tank Rodriguez would rather die than see a teammate hurt. Wire Chen could hack into any system and disable any electronic defense. while Preacher Washington could provide medical support or eliminate threats with equal skill. Bulldog O'Connor's explosives expertise had gotten them out of more tight situations than Sarah could count, and even Kid Stevens, despite his youth, had proven himself in combat multiple times. The assault began at exactly 0347 hours, with Bulldog's carefully placed charges creating a spectacular explosion at the main gate that drew the attention of most of the guards. Sarah led her team through the breach in the northern wall, expecting to find the compound in chaos as the defenders rushed toward the explosion. Instead, they found themselves facing a perfectly organized ambush, with Taliban fighters positioned in locations that allowed them to catch the SEALs in a deadly crossfire. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when Wyatt Chen's radio went dead just as he was reporting successful penetration of the compound. Sarah tried to raise him on the team frequency, but heard only static. Then she heard the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle, followed by Preacher Washington's voice screaming that Kid Stevens had been hit. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. As her team found themselves pinned down by accurate enemy fire from multiple directions, she realized that their tactical communications had been compromised. The enemy fighters knew exactly where each SEAL was positioned and were coordinating their attacks with a precision that suggested they had detailed knowledge of the team's capabilities and procedures. Jake Morrison managed to reach Sarah's position despite the intense gunfire, blood streaming from a graze on his left arm. "Ghost, we need to get out of here, now. This is a setup." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that David Reeves was somewhere in the compound, probably in the main building that was now surrounded by enemy fighters. The mission parameters were clear. No American would be left behind, regardless of the cost. She made the decision that would haunt her for the next 18 months. "Tank, Bulldog, can you reach the main building?" she called over the radio. Tank's voice came back immediately, strained but determined. "We can try, Ghost, but it's going to cost us. There are at least 20 fighters between us and that building." Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation that she possessed. "All units converge on the main building. We're not leaving without Reeves." What she didn't know was that David Reeves was already dead, killed by his Taliban captors 3 days earlier once they had extracted all the information they needed from him. The rescue mission had been designed from the beginning as a trap, using the SEALs' own honor code against them. The military's commitment to never leaving a soldier behind had been turned into a weapon that would destroy some of America's most elite warriors. The battle for the main building lasted 47 minutes, during which Sarah's team fought with a courage and determination that would have made them legends if anyone had survived to tell their story. Tank Rodriguez single-handedly eliminated 8 enemy fighters while providing covering fire for his teammates to advance. Bulldog O'Connor used his explosives expertise to breach 3 separate defensive positions, taking shrapnel wounds that would have incapacitated a lesser man. Wyatt Chen managed to restore partial communications long enough to call for emergency extraction, but the helicopter pilot reported that the landing zone was too hot for a safe approach. The team was on their own, surrounded by enemy forces in hostile territory, with no immediate prospect of rescue. It was during the final assault on the main building that Sarah Martinez made the discovery that would change everything. As she cleared the last room where David Reeves was supposed to be held, she found not a captured CIA operative, but a sophisticated communications center filled with equipment that was far too advanced for Taliban forces. Maps on the walls showed detailed intelligence about American operations throughout the region, and computer screens displayed real-time information about US IAG military movements. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a rescue mission gone wrong. This was a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate her entire team. Someone with access to classified information had set them up, using their own loyalty and dedication as weapons against them. Before she could fully process the implications of her discovery, an explosion rocked the building. Taliban fighters had detonated charges that brought down part of the structure, trapping Sarah in the communications room while cutting off her escape route. She could hear her team members calling for her over the radio, their voices growing increasingly desperate as they realized their commander was trapped. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the static. "Ghost! Respond! We're coming for you." Sarah keyed her radio one last time, knowing that what she was about to say would be the hardest words she had ever spoken. Negative. Get out now. That's an order. We don't leave anyone behind. Jake's response was immediate and emotional. You're not leaving me behind, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I'm staying behind to make sure you all get home safely. The last thing Sarah heard before the building collapsed completely was Tank Rodriguez shouting her name over the radio. Then there was darkness, silence, and the beginning of a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about honor, loyalty, and survival. When the dust settled and the Taliban fighters confirmed that no one could have survived the building collapse, they reported to their handlers that the American team leader was dead. The information was relayed through a complex network of contacts until it reached the desk of a man in Virginia who had been waiting for exactly this confirmation. He made a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds, speaking only 4 words: "The ghost is dead." What none of them knew was that Sarah Martinez had survived the building collapse, trapped in a partially collapsed basement with serious injuries but very much alive. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her team fighting their way to the extraction point, she made a decision that would define the next phase of her life. She would not try to signal for rescue. She would not attempt to rejoin her team. Instead, she would use everyone's belief in her death to uncover the truth about who had betrayed them and why. The woman who had spent her entire adult life following orders and working within the system was about to become something entirely different. Sarah Martinez, the Navy SEAL commander, was dead. What would emerge from the rubble of that Afghan compound would be something far more dangerous, a ghost with nothing left to lose and a burning need for justice. As the sounds of helicopters faded into the distance, carrying her wounded but surviving team members to safety, Sarah began the slow and painful process of digging herself out of her own grave. She had no way of knowing that her decision to remain hidden would lead her into a world of international conspiracy, betrayal at the highest levels of government, and a final confrontation that would test not just her skills as a warrior, but her very soul. The ghost was about to be reborn, and when she emerged from the shadows, nothing would ever be the same. Sarah's first conscious thought after the building collapse was that she was supposed to be dead. The irony wasn't lost on her as she lay trapped beneath concrete slabs and twisted metal, her left leg pinned and her ribs screaming with every breath. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her right shoulder felt like it had been separated, but she was alive when everyone believed otherwise. The basement she found herself in had once been used for storage, evident from the scattered supplies and equipment around her. Most importantly, there was a partially collapsed tunnel that appeared to lead away from the main building. Sarah realized that the Taliban had been using this compound for more than just holding prisoners. They had built it as a command center with multiple escape routes. It took her 6 hours to free herself from the debris, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid causing further collapse. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but Sarah had endured worse during SEAL training. The instructors had always said that the only easy day was yesterday, and yesterday she had been a respected military officer with a clear mission and a team she could trust. Today, she was a ghost with nothing but questions and a burning need for answers. Her first priority was medical attention. The leg wasn't broken, but it was badly bruised and swollen. Her ribs were likely cracked but not displaced, and the shoulder would heal with time. More concerning was the head wound, which could indicate a concussion. Sarah had enough medical training to know that she needed rest, fluids, and proper treatment, but she also knew that staying in the compound was certain death. As she explored the basement more thoroughly, Sarah discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind a false wall was a sophisticated intelligence center, far more advanced than the communications equipment she had found upstairs. Computer servers hummed quietly in climate-controlled cases, their screens showing real-time data feeds from what appeared to be surveillance operations throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. But it was the photographs pinned to one wall that truly shocked her. High-resolution images of her entire team, including detailed dossiers with personal information about their families, homes, and routines. Jake Morrison's wife Maria was there, photographed outside the hospital where she worked. Tank Rodriguez's 3 daughters were shown playing in their backyard in San Diego. Even Kid Stevens' girlfriend was documented pictured at the college where she was studying to become a teacher. Sarah realized with growing horror that her team hadn't just been set up for elimination in Afghanistan. Their families had been under surveillance for weeks, possibly months. This wasn't a Taliban operation. It was something far more sophisticated and far-reaching. Someone with significant resources and high-level intelligence access had orchestrated not just their mission, but what appeared to be preparations for eliminating anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about their deaths. She photographed everything she could with her damaged phone, despite the pain in her shoulder, then began searching for any evidence that might identify who was behind the operation. What she found in the computer files made her understand why her death had been so important to someone. The servers contained detailed records of arms shipments, drug trafficking operations, and financial transactions that implicated high-ranking officials in both the US and Afghan governments. Someone had been using the war in Afghanistan as cover for a massive criminal enterprise, selling weapons to both sides while facilitating the drug trade that funded Taliban operations. The profits were being laundered through a network of shell companies and ultimately ending up in accounts controlled by American citizens, including at least 2 sitting congressmen and a deputy director at the CIA. Sarah's team had stumbled onto something that threatened to expose the entire network. Their mission to rescue David Reeves had been a setup from the beginning, designed to eliminate the one SEAL team that had been operating in areas where they might have discovered evidence of the criminal enterprise. David Reeves himself had likely been killed because he had learned too much, not because he had been turned by the Taliban. As Sarah studied the files, she began to understand the scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about corruption or war profiteering. It was about a systematic betrayal of everything she had sworn to protect. American soldiers were dying to protect profits for criminals who wore suits and attended congressional hearings. The Taliban was being supplied with weapons and intelligence by the same government officials who sent young Americans to fight them. The most damning evidence was a series of communications between someone identified only as Prometheus and various criminal associates. The messages made it clear that Prometheus had access to classified military information and was actively working to eliminate anyone who threatened the network. Sarah's team had been specifically targeted after their operations in Kunar province had come too close to discovering a major arms cache that was supposed to be delivered to Taliban forces. Sarah spent 3 days in the underground facility, recovering from her injuries while documenting everything she could find. The tunnel system was more extensive than she had initially realized, connecting to a natural cave network that extended for miles underground. More importantly, she discovered that the facility was still active, with scheduled communications from Prometheus expected within the next 48 hours. She made a decision that went against every instinct she had developed as a military officer. Instead of trying to contact her superiors or attempting to return to friendly forces, Sarah decided to remain hidden and gather more intelligence. If someone with access to classified information was trying to eliminate her team, then returning through official channels would likely result in her actual death. On her 4th day in hiding, Sarah intercepted the scheduled communication from Prometheus. The conversation was brief but revealed several crucial pieces of information. First, Prometheus was definitely American, speaking with an accent that suggested education and high social status. Second, he was operating from within the Washington, D.C. area, making references to meetings and locations that were clearly domestic. Third, and most troubling, he was already planning the elimination of Sarah's surviving team members. The conversation revealed that Jake Morrison, Tank Rodriguez, and the others had been debriefed about the failed mission and were asking uncomfortable questions about the intelligence that had led them into the trap. Prometheus was concerned that their continued investigation might expose the larger operation and had authorized what he called domestic solutions to ensure their silence. Sarah realized that her decision to remain hidden might have inadvertently saved not just her own life, but the lives of her surviving teammates. As long as everyone believed she was dead, Prometheus would focus on eliminating the obvious threats. But if she revealed herself too soon, she would not only put herself in danger, but would also accelerate the timeline for eliminating the rest of her team. She began planning her next moves with the same methodical precision she had used for military operations. First, she needed to establish secure communications with someone she could trust who was outside the compromised chain of command. Second, she needed to gather enough evidence to expose the entire network without alerting Prometheus to her survival. Third, she needed to find a way to protect her team members and their families from the domestic threats that were being planned. The solution came from an unexpected source. While exploring the cave system, Sarah discovered that it connected to an old smuggling route that had been used by local tribes for generations. Following the route led her to a small village about 20 miles from the compound, where she encountered an Afghan woman named Amira, who had been working as a translator for American forces. Amira's story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had lost her husband and 2 sons to a Taliban bombing that had been intended to target an American convoy. Instead of turning against the Americans, she had dedicated herself to helping them succeed in Afghanistan, believing that their victory would prevent other families from suffering as hers had. When Sarah appeared in her village, injured and clearly on the run, Amira didn't hesitate to offer help. Through Amira, Sarah learned that the local population was aware of the criminal network that had been operating in their region. The villagers had been forced to cooperate with Taliban forces who were receiving weapons and supplies from mysterious benefactors, but they had also been keeping careful records of everything they observed. The evidence they had gathered corroborated what Sarah had found in the computer files. and added crucial details about how the network operated. Amira introduced Sarah to a network of Afghan civilians who had been working quietly to document the corruption they witnessed. Teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers had all contributed pieces of information that, when assembled, painted a clear picture of how American officials were collaborating with Taliban leaders to maintain the conflict while profiting from both sides. One of the most shocking revelations came from a former Afghan government official named Hassan, who had been forced to flee Kabul after refusing to participate in the criminal enterprise. He explained that the network extended far beyond Afghanistan, involving similar operations in Iraq, Syria, and other conflict zones where American forces were deployed. The total value of the criminal enterprise was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, making it one of the largest corruption schemes in military history. Hassan also provided Sarah with information about Prometheus's identity. Based on communication patterns and operational details, he believed that Prometheus was likely someone with direct access to Pentagon briefings and CIA intelligence reports. The individual would need to be senior enough to influence mission planning and operational decisions, but not so visible that their activities would attract scrutiny. Sarah spent 2 weeks with the Afghan resistance network, recovering from her injuries while helping them organize the evidence they had gathered. During this time, she also began planning her return to the United States. She couldn't simply show up at a military base and announce that she was alive. That would almost certainly result in her immediate elimination by Prometheus's network. Instead, she needed to establish contact with someone she trusted who could help her navigate the dangerous waters of exposing high-level corruption. The obvious choice was Jake Morrison, her second-in-command and closest friend. But contacting him directly would put him in immediate danger. She needed to find a way to warn him and the rest of her team without alerting Prometheus to her survival. The solution came through an encrypted communication system that Amira's network had been using to coordinate with other resistance groups. Sarah was able to send a coded message to Jake Morrison's personal email account, using references and phrases that only he would understand. The message appeared to be spam advertising, but embedded within it was information that would tell Jake that someone with intimate knowledge of their shared experiences was trying to contact him. Jake's response came within 24 hours, also embedded in what appeared to be routine email traffic. He confirmed that he and the other survivors were being pressured to accept reassignment to different units, effectively breaking up the team and preventing them from continuing to investigate the failed mission. More ominously, he reported that Kid Stevens had been involved in a suspicious car accident that had nearly killed him, and that Tank Rodriguez's family home had been burglarized by individuals who seemed more interested in searching the house than stealing anything valuable. Sarah realized that Prometheus was already moving against her team members, using methods that appeared accidental or random but were clearly designed to eliminate potential threats. She had to accelerate her timeline and find a way to protect her people while gathering enough evidence to expose the entire network. Her opportunity came when Hassan provided her with information about a scheduled meeting between Prometheus and his Afghan contacts. The meeting was to take place at a remote location near the Pakistani border, where a major arms shipment was to be finalized. If Sarah could gather intelligence from that meeting, she might be able to identify Prometheus and obtain the evidence needed to expose the entire operation. The plan was dangerous and required Sarah to operate completely alone in hostile territory. She would have to infiltrate the meeting location, gather intelligence, and escape without being detected. If she was discovered, she would face certain death, and her team members would lose their only hope for protection. But Sarah Martinez had not survived SEAL training and multiple combat deployments by avoiding dangerous missions. As she prepared to leave the Afghan village that had become her sanctuary, she made a promise to Amira and the others who had helped her. When she exposed Prometheus and his network, she would ensure that their sacrifices and courage were recognized, and that the truth about what had happened in Afghanistan would finally be told. The woman who had once been Commander Sarah Martinez was about to become something the military had never trained her to be, a lone operative working outside all official channels, accountable to no one but her own conscience and her determination to protect the innocent. The ghost was about to step fully into the shadows, and when she emerged, the entire corrupt network that had betrayed her country would be exposed to the light of justice. As Sarah made her way through the mountains of Afghanistan toward the meeting location, she carried with her not just weapons and equipment, but the hopes of everyone who had been betrayed by the very system they had trusted to protect them. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just her own death, but the continued suffering of countless innocent people who deserve better from the country that claimed to represent freedom and justice.
The most dangerous phase of Sarah Martinez's journey was about to begin, and she was no longer fighting just for her own survival or even for her team.
She was fighting for the soul of the military she had dedicated her life to serving. and for the principles that had made her willing to die for her country in the first place. The meeting location was a centuries-old fortress carved into a mountainside, accessible only by treacherous paths that wound through terrain so hostile that even local shepherds avoided the area. Sarah approached under cover of darkness, her body still aching from injuries that hadn't fully healed. Carrying equipment she had assembled from abandoned supplies, and weapons taken from the compound where she was supposed to have died. 2 weeks of living among the Afghan resistance had taught her things about survival that no military training could provide. She had learned to move like the local people, to think like someone who had spent their entire life navigating between competing forces, and to trust instincts that went deeper than tactical doctrine. The woman approaching the fortress was still Sarah Martinez, but she was also something more dangerous than any SEAL the Navy had ever trained. Through night vision binoculars, Sarah observed the security arrangements around the fortress. This wasn't the casual guard setup typical of Taliban operations. Professional sentries were positioned at strategic points, using military-grade communications equipment and following patrol patterns that suggested advanced tactical training. Whoever Prometheus was, he had access to resources that went far beyond what any single government official could command. Sarah counted at least 20 guards, all carrying weapons that were too new and too expensive for typical Afghan forces. Several wore body armor, marked with logos she recognized from American defense contractors, equipment that should never have been available to hostile forces. The implications were staggering. Someone was not only selling intelligence to America's enemies, but was also providing them with the same protective equipment used by US forces. As she watched the fortress, Sarah identified 3 vehicles parked in a courtyard that had been carved from the living rock. 2 were the type of armored SUVs commonly used by high-ranking military officials, while the third was a civilian sedan with diplomatic plates. The presence of diplomatic vehicles suggested that this meeting involved not just military corruption but international criminal activity that crossed multiple governments. Sarah's plan was to infiltrate the fortress during the meeting, record as much as possible of the conversations, and identify the participants. The intelligence she had gathered suggested that Prometheus would be attending this meeting personally, making it her best opportunity to discover his real identity. But getting close enough to record useful intelligence would require her to penetrate security that had been designed by professionals who understood American tactics. She spent 6 hours studying the guard rotations and patrol patterns, looking for vulnerabilities that would allow her to get inside without triggering alarms. The fortress had been designed to withstand medieval sieges, not modern infiltration techniques, and Sarah eventually identified a route that would take her through ancient drainage tunnels that connected to the main structure. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a person to crawl through and filled with centuries of debris, but they offered a way to reach the heart of the fortress without confronting the external security. Sarah entered the tunnel system at 0200 hours, carrying only essential equipment and relying on memorized layouts she had studied from architectural surveys conducted decades earlier by Soviet forces. The journey through the tunnels took 3 hours of agonizing crawling through spaces that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. Sarah's injuries flared with every movement, and several times she had to stop and control her breathing to avoid panic attacks triggered by the crushing claustrophobia. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that her team members' lives depended on her success. She emerged from the tunnels into a storage chamber that connected to the main fortress through a hidden passage that had probably been used by medieval defenders to move supplies during sieges. From this position she could hear voices speaking in multiple languages, including English, Arabic, and what sounded like Russian. The meeting she had come to observe was clearly more international than she had expected. Moving through the ancient corridors with the stealth that had earned her the call sign Ghost, Sarah made her way toward the main chamber where the meeting was taking place. The fortress's thick stone walls muffled most sounds, but she could detect the rhythms of conversation and occasional laughter that suggested the participants were comfortable and confident in their security. Sarah found a position in an alcove that had once held a medieval statue, from where she could observe the main chamber through gaps in the stonework. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the criminal network she had discovered. 7 men sat around a table that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than an ancient fortress. 3 were clearly Middle Eastern, dressed in the expensive casual wear favored by wealthy businessmen. 2 appeared to be European, speaking with accents Sarah couldn't precisely identify but suggesting German or Swiss origins. The remaining 2 were unmistakably American, and one of them made Sarah's blood run cold. Prometheus was Deputy CIA Director Robert Blackwood, a man Sarah had met briefly during a mission briefing 2 years earlier. Blackwood was in his early 50s, with the kind of distinguished appearance that made him popular with congressional committees and media interviews. He had built his reputation on successful counter-terrorism operations and was considered a rising star in the intelligence community. The idea that he was actually orchestrating the corruption that was costing American lives was almost impossible to believe. The other American was someone Sarah didn't recognize, but his military bearing and the respect shown to him by the others suggested he held significant rank. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding others, and his knowledge of operational details suggested current access to classified information. As Sarah listened to their conversation, the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. They weren't just selling weapons to both sides of the conflict. They were actively manipulating military operations to ensure that the war continued indefinitely. Every time peace negotiations showed promise, they would orchestrate attacks or intelligence leaks that would restart hostilities. American soldiers weren't dying to bring democracy to Afghanistan. They were dying to maintain a conflict that generated massive profits for criminals wearing the uniform of their own country. Blackwood's role was to provide intelligence that would allow the network to stay ahead of any investigations, while ensuring that American military operations never succeeded completely enough to end the conflict. He had access to classified reports from military commanders, CIA field operatives, and even NSA communications intercepts. When SEAL teams like Sarah's came too close to discovering evidence of the criminal network, Blackwood would arrange for their elimination under the cover of military operations. The conversation revealed that Sarah's team hadn't been the first to be eliminated for getting too close to the truth. Over the past 3 years, Blackwood had orchestrated the deaths of dozens of American military personnel who had stumbled onto evidence of the criminal network. Some had died in apparent combat operations, others in training accidents, and a few in suspicious circumstances that had been dismissed as personal problems or mental health issues. What made Sarah's situation different was that Prometheus had believed her entire team was dead, eliminating the immediate threat to the network's security. But the conversation revealed that Jake Morrison and the other survivors were asking questions that were making Blackwood nervous. He was planning to eliminate them within the next 2 weeks, using methods that would appear to be unrelated accidents or personal tragedies. Sarah recorded everything she could, using equipment that Amira's network had provided. The evidence would be sufficient to expose the entire criminal enterprise, but only if she could get it to someone who wasn't part of the network. The conversation made it clear that the corruption extended far beyond Blackwood and his immediate associates. Several high-ranking Pentagon officials were mentioned, along with at least 3 sitting congressmen and multiple defense contractors. As the meeting continued, Sarah learned about the next phase of the criminal enterprise. The network was planning to expand their operations to other conflict zones, including potential new wars that they would help instigate in Africa and South America. The profits from the Afghan operation had been so successful that they were seeking to replicate the model wherever American military forces might be deployed. The discussion turned to the logistics of a major arms shipment that was scheduled to arrive within the next 48 hours. The weapons were American-made, supposedly destroyed in a facility accident but actually diverted to the criminal network through falsified documentation. The shipment would provide Taliban forces with enough firepower to launch a major offensive that would kill dozens of American soldiers, while justifying continued U.S. military presence in the region. Sarah realized that she had discovered not just evidence of past crimes, but intelligence about future attacks that would cost American lives. She had to find a way to prevent the arms shipment, while exposing the criminal network without alerting Blackwood to her survival. The challenge was enormous. She was one person operating without official support against a network that had resources and connections throughout the military and intelligence communities. As the meeting broke up, Sarah heard Blackwood make a phone call that chilled her to the bone. He was ordering the elimination of Jake Morrison, claiming that the surviving SEAL commander was becoming too persistent in his questions about the failed mission. The elimination was to be carried out within the next 72 hours, staged to look like a training accident that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. Sarah knew she was running out of time. She had the evidence needed to expose the criminal network, but she also had to save her friend's life and prevent the arms shipment that would cost more American lives. Operating completely alone with no official support and limited resources, she faced challenges that would have been impossible for an entire SEAL team working within the system. But Sarah Martinez had spent her entire adult life overcoming impossible challenges. As she prepared to leave the fortress with the intelligence she had gathered, she began formulating a plan that would require her to become something she had never been trained to be. A one-woman army operating outside all official channels, accountable to no one but her own conscience and her determination to protect the innocent. The plan would require her to return to the United States without being detected, warn her team members without alerting Blackwood to her survival, prevent a major arms shipment from reaching Taliban forces, and expose a criminal network that extended to the highest levels of government. The margin for error was zero. and failure would mean not just her own death but the continued betrayal of everything she had sworn to protect. As Sarah made her way back through the tunnel system that had allowed her to infiltrate the fortress, she carried with her not just recorded evidence of treason, but the weight of knowledge that would change her forever. She had seen the face of the enemy, and it was wearing the uniform of her own country. The woman who had once believed in the system she served was about to become its most dangerous opponent. The ghost was about to return to America, and when she did, she would bring with her a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the military-industrial complex that had betrayed not just her team, but the entire nation they had sworn to protect. The stakes had never been higher, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to serve justice when the system itself had become the enemy. The final phase of her transformation from loyal soldier to avenging angel was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same for anyone involved in the criminal network that had underestimated the determination of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Sarah's journey back to the United States took 3 weeks and required her to become someone she had never been before, a criminal. Using contacts provided by Amira's resistance network, she obtained forged documents and traveled through a chain of smuggling routes that moved her from Afghanistan through Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and finally to Mexico. Every step of the journey put her deeper into a world where survival depended on trusting people whose loyalties could be bought and sold. The woman who crossed the US-Mexico border hidden in a shipping container bore little resemblance to the Navy SEAL commander who had deployed to Afghanistan months earlier. Sarah had lost 25 pounds, her face was scarred from the building collapse, and her eyes carried the hard edge of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. More importantly, she had acquired skills and connections that no military training could provide. Her first priority upon reaching American soil was establishing a secure base of operations. Using money she had obtained through methods she preferred not to think about too carefully, Sarah rented a small apartment in El Paso under a false identity. The location was perfect, close enough to monitor border activity, but far enough from military installations to avoid accidental recognition by former colleagues. From her base in El Paso, Sarah began the most dangerous phase of her mission, re-establishing contact with her surviving team members while remaining invisible to the surveillance network that Robert Blackwood had deployed to monitor them. The intelligence she had gathered at the fortress made it clear that Jake Morrison, Tank Rodriguez, Preacher Washington, and Wyatt Chen were all under active observation, their phones monitored and their movements tracked. Sarah's solution was to use the criminal network she had encountered during her journey home. Through contacts in the smuggling organizations that had helped her cross borders, she gained access to communication methods that operated outside official surveillance systems. Drug cartels and human traffickers had developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection by law enforcement, and those same techniques could be used to evade military intelligence operations. Her first contact was with Wyatt Chen, whose expertise with electronic systems made him the most likely to recognize and respond to unconventional communication methods. Sarah used a technique she had learned from Afghan resistance fighters, embedding coded messages in online video game communications, where they would appear to be routine player interactions. Wyatt's response confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the situation facing her surviving team members. All 4 men had been reassigned to different bases and ordered not to communicate with each other about the failed mission in Afghanistan. Kid Stevens was recovering from his suspicious car accident, but had been told that further questions about the mission could result in charges of insubordination. Tank Rodriguez reported that his family was being harassed by individuals claiming to be conducting routine security clearance investigations, but who seemed more interested in intimidation than information gathering. Most urgently, Jake Morrison was scheduled for a training exercise at a facility known for having the highest accident rate in the Navy. The exercise was supposed to be routine, but the timing and location matched exactly with the elimination plan Sarah had overheard at the fortress meeting. She had less than 48 hours to prevent her closest friend from being murdered by their own government. Sarah's plan required her to infiltrate a secure military facility while remaining undetected by sophisticated surveillance systems. The training facility where Jake was scheduled to die was located in the Virginia mountains, surrounded by restricted airspace and patrolled by security forces who had been trained to detect and eliminate intruders. Getting inside would require skills that went beyond her military training, but Sarah had spent the past month learning from people who made their living by moving through spaces where they weren't supposed to be. She approached the facility using techniques learned from smugglers who crossed international borders carrying contraband worth millions of dollars. Instead of trying to breach the perimeter directly, Sarah studied the legitimate traffic patterns around the base and identified a weakness in the delivery systems that supplied the facility. A food service contractor made regular deliveries using trucks that received only cursory inspection, trusting in background checks and institutional relationships to ensure security. Sarah's infiltration of the contractor's operations required her to temporarily become someone else entirely. Using forged credentials and a carefully constructed cover story, she obtained employment with the food service company and was assigned to the delivery route that serviced the training facility. The process took 18 hours of careful preparation, during which she had to suppress every instinct that told her to act immediately to save Jake's life. The delivery truck that entered the training facility on the morning of Jake's scheduled accident carried more than food supplies. Hidden among the cargo was a woman who had spent the past month transforming herself from a military officer into something far more dangerous. Sarah had become a ghost in the truest sense, capable of moving through secure facilities without being detected by the systems designed to prevent exactly that kind of infiltration. Once inside the facility, Sarah had to locate Jake while avoiding the surveillance cameras and security patrols that monitored every corridor. The training exercise he was scheduled to participate in was designed to simulate high-risk operations, providing perfect cover for an accident that would kill him without raising suspicions. Sarah had studied the facility's layout and identified the most likely locations where such an accident might be staged. She found Jake in the equipment preparation area, going through pre-exercise checks with the kind of professional thoroughness that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. He looked older than Sarah remembered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. The failed mission in Afghanistan had affected him deeply, and the isolation from his teammates had clearly taken a psychological toll. Sarah's approach had to be perfect. If she revealed herself too abruptly, Jake's reaction might alert surveillance systems to her presence. If she waited too long, the accident that was supposed to kill him would proceed as planned. She needed to communicate with him in a way that would immediately establish her identity, while appearing natural to any observers. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah left a small object in Jake's equipment bag, something that only she would have known to include, and only he would recognize. A coin from their first deployment together, inscribed with a message that referenced a shared experience from their SEAL training. When Jake discovered the coin, his reaction would tell her everything she needed to know about whether he could be trusted with the knowledge of her survival. Jake's discovery of the coin was everything Sarah had hoped for. His face showed shock, confusion, and hope in rapid succession, but he maintained enough operational discipline to avoid any outward reaction that might attract attention. Instead, he simply pocketed the coin and continued with his equipment preparation, understanding instinctively that someone was watching, and that his life might depend on appearing normal. Sarah's next communication was more direct. Using techniques learned from her time with Afghan resistance fighters, she positioned herself where Jake could see her briefly during a routine corridor transit. The glimpse was too quick for surveillance cameras to capture clearly, but long enough for Jake to confirm what the coin had suggested. His commander and closest friend was alive and operating inside the facility where he was supposed to die. The training exercise was scheduled to begin in 6 hours, giving Sarah limited time to prevent Jake's elimination while gathering evidence that could be used to expose the larger criminal network. Her plan required her to identify the specific method that would be used to kill Jake, neutralize the threat, and document the evidence in a way that would implicate Robert Blackwood and his associates. Sarah's investigation of the training facility revealed the elegant simplicity of the planned elimination. Jake's exercise involved rappelling from a helicopter onto a target building, a maneuver that SEALs had performed thousands of times without incident. But an examination of the equipment revealed subtle modifications that would cause his rappelling rope to fail at a predetermined point during the descent. The failure would appear to be the result of equipment wear rather than sabotage, making Jake's death appear to be a tragic training accident. The modification was sophisticated enough that only a detailed forensic examination would reveal it as sabotage, and even then, the evidence could be attributed to manufacturing defects rather than deliberate tampering. Whoever had planned Jake's elimination understood both SEAL training procedures and forensic investigation techniques, confirming that the conspiracy extended deep into the military establishment. Sarah's counter-sabotage required her to modify the equipment again, this time to ensure Jake's safety, while creating evidence that would expose the original tampering. She used techniques learned during her SEAL training to make repairs that would be invisible to casual inspection, but would prevent the catastrophic failure that was supposed to kill Jake. More importantly, she documented the original sabotage with photographs and physical evidence that could be used to trace the modifications back to their source. As the training exercise began, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe while remaining undetected by facility security. Jake's performance during the rappelling exercise was flawless, his equipment functioning exactly as it was supposed to, despite the efforts to sabotage it. But Sarah's attention was focused on the observation team that was monitoring the exercise. looking for reactions that would indicate knowledge of the planned elimination. She found what she was looking for in the behavior of Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Pierce, the senior instructor overseeing Jake's training. Pierce's disappointment when Jake's rappelling rope didn't fail was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. More telling was his immediate phone call to report that the exercise had been completed successfully, using language that suggested he had expected a different outcome. Sarah recorded Pierce's communications and documented his behavior, adding another link in the chain of evidence that connected the facility-level sabotage to higher-level conspiracy. But she also realized that Jake's survival would alert Blackwood and his associates that their plan had failed, potentially accelerating their timeline for eliminating the other surviving team members. Her solution was to stage Jake's death in a way that would satisfy Blackwood's surveillance, while allowing Jake to go into hiding under Sarah's protection. The plan required precise timing and complete trust between two people who had learned to rely on each other through years of dangerous operations. During the final phase of the training exercise, Sarah created a controlled explosion that appeared to be an equipment malfunction, generating enough confusion and debris to provide cover for Jake's apparent death. Emergency responders rushing to the scene found evidence of a catastrophic accident but no recoverable body. Exactly the kind of incident that would satisfy investigators while leaving room for doubt about the specific cause of death. What the investigators didn't find was Jake Morrison himself, who had used the confusion to disappear into the wilderness surrounding the training facility. Sarah's evacuation plan took advantage of her knowledge of smuggling routes and safe houses to move Jake to a secure location where they could begin planning their next moves against the criminal network that had tried to eliminate them. The reunion between Sarah and Jake took place in a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any surveillance systems or official oversight. For the first time in months, Sarah was face to face with someone who shared her commitment to exposing the truth and protecting their remaining teammates. But she was also confronting the reality of how much she had changed during her time in the shadows. Jake's reaction to Sarah's survival was everything she had hoped for: joy, relief, and immediate commitment to helping her complete the mission she had undertaken. But his shock at her physical transformation and the method she had used to infiltrate the training facility reminded Sarah of how far she had traveled from the military officer she had once been. The woman sitting across from Jake Morrison in that mountain cabin was still Sarah Martinez, but she was also something more dangerous and more determined than any SEAL the Navy had ever trained. She had become a ghost in the truest sense, capable of moving through hostile territory and accomplishing impossible missions by using skills and connections that existed outside the official system. As Sarah briefed Jake on everything she had discovered, from the fortress meeting in Afghanistan to the criminal network operating within the highest levels of government, she saw in his eyes the same transformation beginning that she had undergone. The loyal military officer was confronting the reality that his own government had tried to kill him, and that everything he had believed about serving his country had been corrupted by people who saw American soldiers as expendable resources in their pursuit of profit. The conversation that took place in that remote cabin would determine not just the fate of Sarah and Jake, but the future of the criminal network that had betrayed everything they had sworn to protect. Two ghosts were about to begin the final phase of their war against an enemy that wore the uniform of their own country, and the stakes had never been higher for everyone involved. The woman who had once been declared dead was about to prove just how dangerous a ghost could be when armed with the truth and the determination to see justice done, regardless of the cost to herself or anyone who stood in her way. The cabin in the Appalachian Mountains became the operational headquarters for the most dangerous mission Sarah and Jake had ever undertaken, exposing a criminal conspiracy that extended to the highest levels of American government while protecting their surviving teammates from elimination. Over the next 72 hours, they developed a plan that would require them to simultaneously operate in the shadows and in the full glare of public scrutiny. Sarah's evidence from the fortress meeting provided the foundation for their strategy, but Jake's intelligence about the current situation facing their teammates added urgency to their timeline. Tank Rodriguez had reported that his family was being subjected to increasingly aggressive harassment, with his youngest daughter being followed to school by individuals who made no effort to hide their surveillance. Preacher Washington had been reassigned to a combat zone where his medical skills made him valuable enough to keep alive, but his questions about the failed mission had resulted in official reprimands that would justify more extreme measures if he continued investigating. Wyatt Chen's electronic warfare expertise had made him too useful to eliminate immediately, but his access to classified systems was being systematically reduced in preparation for his eventual removal. The plan Sarah and Jake developed had three primary objectives: prevent the arms shipment that would cost American lives, expose Robert Blackwood's criminal network to public scrutiny, and protect their teammates while providing them with enough evidence to ensure their own survival. Accomplishing any one of these objectives would have been challenging for a fully supported military operation. Attempting all three while operating outside official channels bordered on impossible. Their first target was the arms shipment that Sarah had learned about during the fortress meeting. Intelligence gathered through Jake's remaining contacts in the Navy revealed that the weapons were being moved through a complex network of defense contractors and logistics companies, all of which had been infiltrated or compromised by Blackwood's organization. The shipment was scheduled to leave from a port facility in Norfolk, Virginia, disguised as routine military aid to Allied forces in the Middle East. Sarah's plan for intercepting the shipment required her to become someone she had never been before, a whistleblower operating within the media spotlight. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but it would only be effective if it reached the right people before Blackwood could use his influence to suppress or discredit it. The challenge was finding journalists and officials who weren't already compromised by the criminal network while ensuring that the evidence was presented in a way that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Jake's role was to make contact with their surviving teammates and provide them with enough information to protect themselves while coordinating their efforts to gather additional evidence. His supposed death gave him the same operational freedom that Sarah's presumed demise had provided, but it also meant that any mistakes would result in actual death for people he cared about. The operation began with Sarah's infiltration of the Norfolk port facility, using skills and contacts she had developed during her journey through the criminal underworld. The port was heavily secured, but Sarah had learned that security systems designed to prevent external threats often had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who appeared to belong within the system. Her approach required her to temporarily become a port authority inspector, using forged credentials and an intimate knowledge of shipping procedures to gain access to restricted areas. The transformation was so complete that even experienced port security personnel accepted her presence without question, demonstrating how much Sarah had learned about operating within systems designed to exclude outsiders. What Sarah discovered at the port confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the criminal enterprise. The weapons shipment was just one part of a massive operation that included not only arms trafficking, but also the smuggling of drugs and other contraband. The criminal network had essentially taken control of significant portions of America's international shipping infrastructure, using it to move illegal goods while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial activity. The documentation Sarah obtained at the port provided a complete picture of how the criminal network operated. Defense contractors were billing the government for weapons that were never delivered to legitimate military forces, instead diverting them to black market buyers who included known terrorist organizations. The profits were being laundered through a network of shell companies that were controlled by some of the same officials who were responsible for overseeing military procurement. More disturbing was the discovery that the network had been operating for years, with roots that extended back to the early phases of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands of American soldiers had died fighting enemies who were armed with weapons that had been diverted from American military supplies, making every member of the criminal network complicit in the deaths of the people they were supposed to be supporting. While Sarah was gathering evidence at the port, Jake was conducting the most dangerous part of their operation, making contact with Tank Rodriguez, Preacher Washington, and Wire Chen while avoiding the surveillance networks that were monitoring them. His approach required him to use communication methods that would appear routine to observers but would convey essential information to teammates who knew how to interpret coded messages. Jake's first contact was with Tank Rodriguez, whose family situation made him the most vulnerable to coercion, but also the most motivated to take action against the criminal network. Using a method that appeared to be a routine social media interaction, Jake provided Tank with information about his family's surveillance and instructions for protecting them, while gathering evidence that could be used against their tormentors. Tank's response revealed the extent to which the criminal network was willing to go to silence potential witnesses. His family had been subjected to psychological warfare designed to make them feel constantly threatened while providing no specific evidence that could be used to file complaints with law enforcement. The harassment was sophisticated enough that it could be dismissed as paranoia, unless the victims had access to information about the larger conspiracy. Jake's contact with Preacher Washington was more complicated because of his deployment to an active combat zone where communications were heavily monitored. The solution was to embed coded messages within routine medical reports that Preacher was required to file, using terminology that would appear normal to censors, but would convey essential information to someone with shared military experience. Preacher's response provided crucial intelligence about how the criminal network operated in combat zones. He had observed weapons and equipment being delivered to Allied forces that were clearly intended for other recipients, with serial numbers and specifications that didn't match official procurement records. More troubling was his discovery that some of the medical supplies he was using to treat American casualties were counterfeit products that had been substituted for genuine medications, potentially contributing to preventable deaths. Wyatt Chen's electronic warfare expertise made him both the most valuable and the most dangerous teammate to contact. His access to classified communication systems could provide essential intelligence, but it also meant that any contact with him would be immediately detected by the same surveillance networks that Jake was trying to avoid. The solution was to use Wyatt's own expertise against the system that was monitoring him. Jake provided him with information that would allow him to detect and circumvent the surveillance systems that were tracking his activities, effectively turning him into a double agent who appeared to be under control while actually working to gather intelligence about his handlers. Wyatt's response provided the final piece of the puzzle that Sarah and Jake needed to understand the full scope of the criminal network. The surveillance systems being used to monitor the surviving SEAL team members were more sophisticated than typical military intelligence operations, involving technology and techniques that were normally reserved for the most sensitive national security investigations. More significantly, Wyatt discovered that the surveillance network extended far beyond the SEAL team members who had survived the failed mission in Afghanistan. Dozens of other military personnel were being monitored, including officers who had no apparent connection to the criminal conspiracy. The implication was that Blackwood's organization was using its access to classified systems to identify and eliminate anyone who might accidentally discover evidence of their activities. As Sarah and Jake assembled the intelligence provided by their teammates, they realized that they were confronting something far larger than a simple corruption scheme. The criminal network had essentially created a shadow government within the military and intelligence establishment, using their positions to influence policy decisions that benefited their criminal activities while eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. The evidence they had gathered was sufficient to expose the entire network, but presenting it effectively would require them to overcome the same institutional protections that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish. Blackwood and his associates had cultivated relationships with journalists, politicians, and law enforcement officials who could be counted on to suppress or discredit any evidence that threatened their interests. Sarah's solution was to simultaneously release the evidence through multiple channels, making it impossible for the criminal network to suppress all of the revelations, while ensuring that the story reached audiences who couldn't be influenced by Blackwood's associates. The plan required precise coordination between multiple moving parts, any one of which could result in the deaths of everyone involved if it failed. The final phase of their operation began with Sarah's emergence from the shadows to present her evidence to a carefully selected group of investigative journalists who had established reputations for exposing government corruption. Her appearance at a press conference in Washington, D.C. created immediate sensation, as the woman who had been declared dead in Afghanistan presented evidence that implicated high-ranking officials in treason and murder. The impact of Sarah's revelations was immediate and devastating for Blackwood's organization. Within hours of her press conference, congressional investigators were demanding access to classified files. Federal prosecutors were opening criminal investigations, and military officials were ordering audits of procurement systems that had been compromised by the criminal network. But the criminal network's response was equally swift and brutal. Sarah had anticipated that exposing herself would result in immediate attempts on her life, and she had prepared for a final confrontation with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill American military personnel to protect their profits. The confrontation took place at the same Norfolk port facility where Sarah had gathered evidence about the arms shipment. Blackwood himself led a team of mercenaries in an attempt to eliminate Sarah, Jake, and their surviving teammates before they could provide additional testimony to investigators. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her military career. She was fighting not against foreign enemies, but against people who wore American uniforms and claimed to represent American interests. The weapons being used against her had been purchased with American tax dollars, and the tactical intelligence being used by her enemies had been derived from the same classified sources that were supposed to protect American military personnel. But Sarah Martinez had spent the past 6 months transforming herself from a military officer into something far more dangerous, a ghost who could move through hostile territory using skills and connections that existed outside the official system. The woman who faced Robert Blackwood and his mercenaries was no longer bound by the rules and regulations that had once defined her life. The confrontation ended with Blackwood's death and the capture of his associates, but not before he made one final attempt to destroy the evidence that would expose the full scope of the criminal network. His efforts failed because Sarah had anticipated his tactics and had prepared multiple backup plans that ensured the evidence would survive even if she didn't. In the aftermath of the Norfolk confrontation, congressional investigations and federal prosecutions dismantled the criminal network that had cost so many American lives. Dozens of officials were indicted, defense contracts worth billions of dollars were cancelled, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. Sarah Martinez was officially reinstated to her rank and decorated for her actions in exposing the conspiracy, but she declined to return to active duty. The woman who had once defined herself through her military service had discovered that true loyalty sometimes required operating outside the system she had sworn to protect. Instead, she established a private organization dedicated to investigating corruption within military and intelligence agencies, using the skills and connections she had developed during her time as a ghost to protect future whistleblowers and expose criminal networks before they could cost more American lives. Jake Morrison and the other surviving members of their SEAL team joined her organization, creating a group of elite operators who were accountable to no one but their own consciences, and their commitment to protecting the people who served their country with honor. The woman who had been declared dead in Afghanistan had risen from the shadows to become something the military had never trained her to be, a guardian angel watching over the people who had no one else to protect them from the enemies who wore the same uniform they did. The ghost had completed her transformation, and America was safer because a woman with nothing left to lose had been willing to sacrifice everything to serve justice when the system itself had become the enemy. Her story would be remembered not just as an example of individual courage, but as proof that sometimes the greatest patriots are those who love their country enough to save it from itself.